the Cambrian fauna, it's composed of organisms that we're actually quite familiar with in the modern day. Things like sponges, a group called cnidarians, and another group of worms. And so I'm going to explain what these are now, but they're actually organisms that almost everybody knows about. The first one, the sponges. They're used by people around the world to cleaning up a surface. Sponges are good to use for that. Now, the original sponges that we use for human applications, they used to be all natural sponges. They were sponges that grew on the seafloor. And these sponges are quite remarkable because they originated and radiated and developed a very simple body plan that let them take advantage of the hydrological setting they lived in on the seafloor. So what they became were very porous networks of holes that were in a kind of a spongy-like material that was their body mass. And then buried within that were these exoskeletons. In this case, they were small flecks called spicules. But what they do is that they grow off the seafloor and they put their holes above the seafloor. And as currents move across the seafloor, the currents actually stick and drag as they touch the seafloor. And therefore, as you move up from the seafloor, the lowest part of the seafloor has lower wave velocities and the upper ones have higher wave velocities. So basically, sponges developed to make a tube that ran from the low velocities to the high velocities. And you can run this experiment yourself. If you have water flowing in a bathtub and you make a current at the bottom and you just put a vertical tube into it, it'll automatically passively pump. If there's a differential gradient in the velocity of the water from the bottom to the top, then that water will automatically pump from the bottom upward and out. So the sponges were remarkable engineers. They were able to develop these body plans that took place, that took advantage of their place on the seafloor. Now this next group, I call them cnidarians. And cnidarians, most commonly the ones we know about are things like jellyfish and corals. And the cnidarians are a group of metazoans that make exoskeletons that are unified by having a modified cell. Now this cell is remarkable. It has a very sensitive outer membrane and it's kind of clustered together within the outer tissue of the, in this case, either jellyfish or corals. And if that outer tissue gets brushed by something, let's say it's a fish that they want to prey on, then those cells actually explode and they release a harpoon. So there's a beautifully crafted harpoon right in the middle of the cell. It comes shooting out of the cell and the harpoon has prongs on it. So when it goes into whatever it penetrates, it sticks and you can't pull it out. Now on top of that, that harpoon is actually attached by a tether, a small line that goes back to the cell. And as soon as that harpoon leaves the cell, enters whatever tissue, in this case, let's say it's a fish that they want to eat, enters that tissue, hooks and stays, as soon as the tether gets taut and gets extended, then toxin shoots from the cell through the tether into the harpoon. And depending on how many times it gets stung by these cells, it can either slow down or actually kill and paralyze the organism they're trying to eat. So these stinging cells are called nematocysts, and the stinging cells are what unites this group called cnidarians. And again, for our purposes, remembering that they represent jellyfish and corals are fine. And then the third group, worms. Again, worms are common in all terrestrial environments almost, especially the ones that we have soils in. These organisms that are long, segmented, and they move by contracting and expanding muscle sets. And they slither through the ground, they like it wet. And there's something that again, we're pretty familiar with in the modern day. So things like sponges and cnidarians and worms were part of this early explosion of organisms. Now, some other ones that then evolved at the same time and then became part of this fauna, again, this grouping of animals that lived, in this case, on the seafloor, were things like brachiopods. Now, brachiopods were first described by Aristotle, and he called them the lamp shells. And the brachiopod has two shells that come together. We call them valves. Each shell is a valve. And those shells come together. And they have a beautiful type of symmetry, where if you pass the plane of symmetry between the two valves, then they'll be equivalent on both sides. So they open up. And what we see is that in the shell, though, instead of having a large mass of tissue that might be eating organic matter in different ways, it has a very feathery structure called a lophophore. And the lophophore within two shells is what defines the group of brachiopods. Brachiopods have a close cousin called bryozoans. They also have this feathery lophophore it's like a feather that comes out with small tentacles off of it, and it allows them to capture small food particles out of the sea column. And the bryozoans are different though. Instead of having two valves that are together, they're actually, they live in what looks like a coffin. One of the valves is very large and the other one's very small, and then one valve opens up and they stick out their lophophore and they feed. Another group that came on board at that same time that's extremely important to us are the bivalves, the mollusks. And again, these are some of the same ones that we still have in the modern day. These are the classic seashells, where again they have two valves. And then instead of like the brachiopods, which have a plane of symmetry that cuts down through the two shells, the two valves, this one has a plane of symmetry that runs along and between the two shells. And so the famous pecten that's used for all kinds of decorations, and also it's a very famous piece of art, is an example of a bivalve. The kind of clams that people eat to make seafood and make chowder, those are all forms of bivalves. Another group that was present in this time period are the trilobites. And the trilobites are quite unique. They're actually related closely to modern day insects. And the trilobites were basically an insect-looking organism that cruised around on the seafloor. Some of them lived on the bottom, just directly above the sediment-water interface, and other ones slightly burrowed through the mud, and they were very good at extracting organic matter from those environments. Another group that came on at this time are sea urchins. The sea biscuits, the sea urchins, the irregular and regular echinoids. The echinoids mean the spiny skinned ones. And then the groups that are very unique in terms of going from invertebrate to vertebrate, the tunicates, the sea squirts, those are what we call the hemichordates, the ones that have a type of early backbone only in the embryonic stages, which gets absorbed. So as a juvenile, they're actually more or less a vertebrate, and as an adult, they become an invertebrate. Another one of the stars of the Cambrian fauna is an organism that still lives in the modern day oceans, and where you have an ocean that floods up onto the shoulder of a continent and makes a large inland bay. It's one of the places where these organisms like to still live, and they're called horseshoe crabs. So one example in North America is Florida Bay is a place that horseshoe crabs do extremely well. They also live up and down the entirety of the east coast of the U.S. But they occur any place around the world where you have those right environments. The horseshoe crabs are remarkable. First of all, they're very, very closely related to the trilobites. And so trilobites went extinct at the end of the Cambrian fauna. That was one of the organisms that did very well and then was outcompeted, and the environment changed. So we don't have any modern day trilobites, but the trilobites that we do have living are an ancestor of the trilobites called the horseshoe crabs. And if you look at the very earliest stages of horseshoe crab development, they look identical to many of the types of trilobites we have in the fossil record. What we see commonly, one of the strategies within evolution, is that as time goes on and organisms evolve and become more successful in environments, some of their earlier stages of development, they're actually pushed farther into the history of the life of one organism. So in other words, things that evolve through time, as they change and adapt to environmental constraints and competition and predation, some of the earlier forms of what the organism looked like are actually pushed into the early stages of the growth of the individual organisms. And we describe that with a phrase that is ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Ontogeny is the growth history of one single organism. Phylogeny is the history of evolution of all lineages of that organism through time. And so what we see is that ontogeny, the history of the growth of one organism going from a baby to an adult, what we see is during ontogeny, the very earliest stages of phylogeny, which is evolution from an earlier ancestor to later organisms, we see that those natural natural experiments in the face of natural selection and other processes that go on, they're actually captured and preserved in that individual organism, but they're only shown and expressed when the organism is very young and very small. And as they grow to be older, then they have different morphologies. So the early stages of horseshoe crabs are in that same ilk. Another thing that's critically important about horseshoe crabs is that they're the only metazoan that we know of that had a blood based on copper. So their blood is actually blue. Most organisms like ourselves, we have an iron-based blood system. And it has to do with, the reason that's been successful is that it is a very effective means for having iron then react with oxygen. And it's a good way to transport oxygen throughout the internal system of a metazoan. But the blue-blooded horseshoe crabs are one that have done extremely well in terms of being successful, but they have this unique history of having a copper-based blood, which turns the blood blue. So the horseshoe crabs are one good example of how we have a living record of ancient organisms that are still alive, if you will, living fossils. But in the history of the development of any one of these living fossils going from a juvenile into an adult, we have buried within that the record of the earlier stages of evolution and phylogeny that were part of the development of these organisms. So the horseshoe crabs have been around since the Cambrian, but they have actually evolved significantly beyond that. And their earliest ancestors were very, very closely related to the trilobites. So these organisms that lived on the seafloor were they dominated and proliferated, and they created these great assemblages of life on the seafloor that we call reefs. And the word reef, R-E-E-F, is a word that, again, most people know, but it's very poorly known how to define it by most people. And the idea there is that a reef is a structure on the seafloor, or it could be a lake floor, but in this case it's a seafloor. It's a structure on the seafloor that is stuck together and rigid, and it can resist waves. In other words, when waves come along, if there's a bump on the seafloor, that bump is resistant enough to push back and not be pulverized and spread out by the waves. Now, the word reef then can be a group of organisms on the seafloor, but it can also be a group of rocks on the seafloor. And this word reef was actually derived from the Norse word riff, R-I-F, and it means the human rib. And so a coral reef is a group of corals along with some of the other organisms we talked about, the brachiopods and the bivalves and the clams and snails and all these other groups that are living on the seafloor. So the whole notion of having a group of animals get together and create a community on the seafloor, and when they live and conduct their everyday life together in these assemblages, again, they're invertebrates. And because they have an exoskeleton, their skeletons all accumulate in place, and it makes an accumulation of rock. And then that accumulation of rock, based on these exoskeletons, is wave resistant, and it sticks off the seafloor. So the idea of communities on the seafloor, when corals were dominant, we call them coral reefs. When brachiopods are dominant, we call them brachiopod, bryozoan, bivalve reefs. Whatever makes up the major part of the community living on the seafloor, that's what we use as their name. So the Cambrian fauna was the initiation and the introduction to the seafloor of these invertebrates that would live in communities, create these accumulations, and then these accumulations through time become fossilized. And so these fossilized reef communities provided us with a dramatically detailed record of the ecology of what was happening on the seafloor. And again, the thinking here is that these communities of the Cambrian fauna that were developing these reef organizational entities on the seafloor, that they then ended up setting the template for the early oceans within the Paleozoic. Now, there were a whole series of other events that took place, things like meteor impacts. We had additional formation of ice. We had other events, volcanic eruptions that took place in that early Paleozoic, the Cambrian, the Ordovician, the Silurian, and then into the Devonian. So as an accumulation of all these events together with the ongoing exchange going from some organisms originating, radiating, evolving, and then going extinct, that Cambrian community did well, but more or less went extinct by about the time of the Devonian. Some of them got through, but others did not. So that Cambrian fauna set the stage for seafloor ecology. And some of these strategies then were used by different organisms that replaced them through geological time.